Good morning, everyone. Let's make a start. Thanks for joining. My name's Russ Turner, and I'll be your instructor this morning for the next 90 minutes. So we'll be on now till 10:30 Central Time, and we're going to do trauma-informed care. Quick note, this session is being recorded and will be posted to the DHS website later in the year. So thanks for joining. A little bit of housekeeping. So in the participant list, you'll see the name Brett Paulson. He's the co-host for the session. Thanks, Brett. You can reach out to him with issues unrelated to the material, and I'll take care of the material. So we're working as a team. Let's see. So we did the recording. We are going to talk about mental health and trauma in this session. So there are some tough topics in here. So be aware that that's the direction we're headed. And I'll talk about how being trauma informed doesn't mean avoiding difficult topics. It means approaching them in the right way. And so thanks for engaging with the topic today. It's our belief it promotes the community's health and well-being. So just a note on my organization. Me and Brett work for the Training Institute, which is part of People Incorporated Mental Health Services. People Incorporated's been around for 55 years. It's the largest community-based mental health agency in the state of Minnesota. And with a training department, essentially. We do training for our staff and we do training for the community as well. Different types of projects. So we'll often go out to organizations and do sessions related to their workplace. And it's interesting because really we're bringing, workforce trainings built for mental health practitioners, social workers, case managers, but bringing them into different types of environments. So it's been an interesting, about a decade we've been doing that. We do trainings in basically these three areas, and we're adding children and adolescents. So thanks to DHS for making this collaboration possible. So this is me. You can hear from my accent that I was not born in Minnesota, but have lived here a long time now, but coming up on 24 years. And I've been at People Incorporated for about 18. You can see a little bit about me in my background there. I think one of the more useful things for what we're doing this morning is that I'm an adoptive father. So I have two adopted children. And what we like to say is we're an adoptive family. Is sort of more inclusive way of saying that. I have a son from Guatemala and a daughter from South Korea. They're kind of getting old now. 14, nearly 15 actually, and 18. All right. One sec. I'm just going to change a setting on my computer. All right. Sorry about that. Thanks for your patience. Got to get the settings how you want them on the presenter end. Yeah, so a little bit about me. If you have any questions, you can hit me up in the chat at any time, and that'll be the rule basically for the session. So we're in our hospital staff series here, and I just wanted to quick show you that we have a 10 class series and we're at the beginning. All right. So there's things that come up usually that people will say, well, what about this? And what about that? And that's all good. But I want you to know that we're headed through a long series of 90-minute trainings where we're going to build this base today of understanding trauma and the idea of being trauma informed in our work. And then on top of that, we can build more specific ideas about how to support patients. So just so that you could get a visual of that, I wanted to put out that list. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to chat them in. All right, so we're at the beginning of the journey. And I think it's the correct place to start because of firm understanding of what's happened and how that's affected children is going to be a major driver of, as you can see, how to work with a crisis, manage their behaviors, make plans, etc. All right, so that's our class description for this morning. I won't read it to you word for word, but at the end is the point really. We're trying to conceptualize the nature of the problem of a person whose brain has a lived experience of trauma and often chronic trauma, and we'll get into that, and like what is going on for them. And so the goal then is to think about, well, how do you provide care that actually doesn't re-traumatize people? Because unfortunately, many systems are built in such a way that the care that the person gets actually ends up being like another trauma. So that's the longer term goal of trying to understand this material. Okay. So basic learning objections. We're going to think about, I'm going to show you a little bit of the research and think about what might happen in a hospital that could be considered a mechanism of re-traumatization, leading us towards some trauma-informed practices. Okay. So Mabel, yeah, we do a session in there called equity and cultural considerations. Thanks for the question. So let's start at the beginning with some definitions because we have to kind of figure out what we're even talking about here. I've noticed in my career in mental health training, there's a lot of terminology that's used clinically by, a mental health professional, and it's also used in the general population. And a word like trauma is a pretty good example, actually. So it's important for us to understand what a mental health clinician means when they talk about trauma. And just keep in mind that people use that word in a more general sense as well. The same thing happens with words like anxiety, depression. So let's have a look at that first. Trauma, I've actually got one or two different examples for you, two different definitions. So here's American Psychiatric Association. Um, and I think in there you can see pretty strong language, right? You know, intense feelings of helplessness, terror, and lack of control, and the threat to one's existence. So pretty strong. Um, for many people, uh, a bad experience isn't a traumatic experience if you analyze it clinically. A breakup is not a trauma. Getting a C on a test is not a trauma. It is disappointing and annoying and maybe very upsetting, but it's not a trauma because look at this definition in here. This is where your existence is threatened. Having an argument with a friend is not a trauma. For many people, even something like a car crash isn't a trauma. Most war veterans do not have trauma. Many do, but many don't. And this is an important thing for us to realize. We've used this rather less clinical definition quite successfully over the years. I really like it because it gets to the point. Experiences that overwhelm one's capacity to cope. What happens is, when people have an experience that threatens their existence, um, your sense, like one's sense of security, it goes away, and you feel helpless in a dangerous world. What we're going to see is that psychological trauma leaves a person struggling with their emotions, memories, um, anxiety that doesn't go away. It can leave people feeling disconnected, feeling numb, have difficulty trusting people, including workers in a system, in an institution. Um, so so what happens is it's not this sort of objective, like, you know, definition of what happened that really derives the idea of trauma. It's whether the person can cope or not. And this definition is nice because if you think about your day, right, maybe today, you you'll sort of navigate the world, right? You'll go through the world using various strategies to cope, right? You'll take little breaks, you'll text a friend, um, maybe text another friend, you know, drink some water, have a little walk, do a breathing exercise. I don't know, get some candy. There's this whole list of things that we do all day that keep us grounded, keep us like focused on what we're supposed to be doing, keep us productive, keep us um, basically like tracking in the right direction in our work, in our studies, maybe in our parenting, that kind of thing. And what happens to people with trauma is often that those strategies just don't work and they can't stay focused, keep tracking, keep basically like staying functional. So in the DSM, that Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, if you look carefully at the definitions of the various psychiatric disorders, they make the note that it affects someone's functioning, and that's the word they use is functioning. What they're getting at is now they're sort of compromised so that school is hard, a hospital stay becomes intolerable, can't work, and that the functioning is gone. And the basic coping strategies don't work anymore. So I really like this framing of the problem. Bessel van der Kolk is one of the leading researchers on trauma in this country and around the world. And his definition here is really nice. It really gets to the point quickly because this is what you're going to see, and this is what you do see. It's a person who inadvertently and perhaps we could say subconsciously, like organizes their life as if the trauma is going on, even when it's not. And that's the key. Like every encounter now could be that dangerous encounter that they had before. And so he uses the word contamination. And I think that's a really good use of language. It's like my interaction with a teacher, let's say, it's not neutral, it's contaminated because maybe this teacher in my hindbrain like reminds me of what happened, but I can't really remember it, but there's something wrong. There's a kind of contamination. So that's what we're dealing with. You know, people who they're desperately trying to navigate the world, but there's a kind of contamination there. And as we'll see, most people who have trauma really don't fully understand it, or even in some cases, they don't even know. For example, right, imagine a situation where a veteran, I'll use a sort of traditional type of trauma example. A veteran returns from duty in Iraq, approaches a intersection in his car. Suddenly the light turns red. And instead of stopping, he just hits the gas and guns it straight across. Now his family are screaming at him and what are you doing? And what's happened is uh, that's what you would do in a war zone. Like he might have learned, like, don't stop at an intersection. Like that's when the bomb goes off. So something flips in his brain. And so that would be a good example because that behavior, right, in my example, gunning it across an intersection, that's a behavior that was useful in a certain context where there was great danger, but it's not a useful behavior now in a different context. And that's what happens. People get stuck in behaviors. The brain sort of switches them on, but they're contextually like a mismatch. So people get annoyed, people get upset, they get in trouble, and everything's sort of contaminated. So it really, really affects how people function, how they live, how they navigate relationships, jobs, study. And then for people who don't have trauma, it's difficult to understand. And then, you know, that's part of the education is to figure out what's happening so we can understand it better. And it's still not easy. Now, let's go a bit deeper because trauma at this stage is still a very kind of broad and generic word in a way. So I want to focus on actually three different elements. I want to think about individual trauma first. This is the traditional way of thinking about it. It's like, okay, whatever happened to one person. So we're talking about an individual. All right. And so in there, you think about acute traumas, like a car accident, a natural disaster, sexual assault, something like that, happens to one person. And if it's acute, the idea is it happened one time. So that's one sort of category, if you like. However, what we see, when I say we, I mean the mental health community. We don't really see that very often. We see chronic trauma. We see an experience of multiple traumatic events, domestic violence, poverty, homelessness, things that just recur, go on and on and on. But then actually building on that idea, a better description that's used by psychologists now is complex trauma. And so that means exposure to chronic traumatic stressors, all right, like chronic, but they're interpersonal, premeditated, planned, and they affect a person's developing neurobiology. So, you know, the best example, I think, would be ongoing physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. That's there's so much happening there that it's considered complex. And the key part is that it affects a person's developing brain. It affects a child's development. Yeah. So that's pretty complex. So psychologists thought, well, let's have a term for that because we're going a bit further. So as you can see, as we start to build that concept, individual trauma can be a lot of different things. So it's always an individual experience. That said, it happens to groups. So now I would like to add another bubble, a circle, a sort of representation of the idea that trauma happens to groups. So we use the word collective, a traumatic psychological effect shared by a group of people. And it could be any size, be a very small group like a family, or it could be a very big group like an entire culture or an entire race. It's a group. It could be an entire society. And so in here, there's different types of ideas that have been sort of developed, especially over the last decade, of the idea of like, well, could you kind of inherit a trauma? Like, could it be passed through generations? And the answer's, it seems like yes. Um, things that happen 2, 3, 4 generations ago, that are terrible, um, affect people today. The exact mechanism by which it's transferred is a point of contention, but it seems pretty clear that there is some sort of mechanism, and it's linked to culture. So if one comes from a group that's like lives in fear of discrimination, of persecution, then you pick that up. To put it in simple terms, you kind of catch it. And then so the point here is that it can be it can be, and it often is, a group of people. And then those groups become sort of like entwined in the system, enmeshed in systems, as I alluded to at the beginning, that sometimes produce even more trauma. So the criminal justice system will literally take people with trauma and then incarcerate them, and the actual incarceration is a new trauma. So you can see that where's the trauma coming from? Well, it's coming from multiple places is the point. So it's quite a lot going on. And we could add more bubbles, but that's the basic idea. Now, one more is worth a big mention here, and that's the idea of vicarious trauma. And all that means is if you get around people with trauma, I mean, usually at work, but not always, just could be in the community because of the collective nature, it could be within the family, then you pick that up too. Yeah, basically, it affects you. It gets to you, is the way I like to say it. And we're going to be thinking a little bit about how the brain does this. But basically, it's picking up threats, producing a stress response, and vicariously becoming traumatized, even though technically the event didn't happen to me. So if I use me as an example, if I'm providing care to especially children who have a lot of trauma, that's not a neutral thing. Like I'll hear stories, I'll see things, I'll hear narratives that really deeply can affect me and my whole psychological well-being. So that's the other category of vicarious trauma. So what we have as we build these ideas into this picture is that we're working with people who have all of this, all of it. It's very, very complex. It's neurodevelopmental and it goes back generations. It's historical and there's just a lot there. So what does trauma look like? Good question. In mental health world, you you'd be looking at the word symptoms, right? What are the symptoms? Well, there's a lot. I started making lists and I stopped because these symptoms seem to encompass almost all different types of mental health symptoms could go in this category. These are some of the big ones. And if you look at the literature, you know, the lists are very organized. And so, you know, a person might meet criteria for clinical depression. So there's the list of depression, or it might meet the list for anxiety, and there's the list for anxiety. And maybe they have both. So now they have these lists. But in reality and in, you know, it's usually just a big mess. And, you know, it can be, people are just sort of like all over the place, if you like. So it's hard to pin down. So what often happens is people kind of pick up diagnoses sort of as they go. So in one kind of part of their life, they'll pick up a diagnosis of generalized anxiety. In another one, they'll pick up a diagnosis of ADHD. And in another one, they might pick up a diagnosis maybe of bipolar or something like that. And this is pretty common that as a person gets older and they go through adolescence, become a young adult, and they end up with this whole clinical list of different diagnoses, and a lot of it's trauma. That's really what it is. And the other thing to keep in mind, and I know that you've seen this, is that a lot of these symptoms really look like bad behavior, you know, quote unquote. Or it might just look like this, which is a whole load of nothing, a kind of empty shell, kind of numbness, a sort of like detachment from the world. So it's very broad set of things that trauma could end up looking like, which makes it a little difficult to pin down. But that's why we think of it more as like the foundation in a way of what's happening. Yeah, the slide is purposely empty. So now we have some definitions of trauma. Let's think about what the research says. And I'm going to walk you through some of the most important research in the last 20 years on trauma. You may have heard of ACEs. I'm going to sort of fill in the gaps here. ACE stands for adverse childhood experience. So the question is, all right, what kind of adversity are you talking about? When does it happen and why does it matter? So adversity in childhood is a little topic here. Now, the original study, and we'll find out why in a sec, looked at these 10 categories. And the number 10 is really important, as you'll see. The 10 categories that you're looking at were chosen because they were found to be common in clinical settings, and the findings were very consistent. Now, you might say, well, you could add more, and that's true. But as the researchers started to get a hold of this concept, these were the 10 they studied. All right. So let's hear from the original author of the ACE study. Then this is like going back into the mid-90s as we do a little historical analysis here of where this comes from. Because he lays it out real nice. Disclaimer, he is going to make some references to obesity and difficulties with weight loss. Just FYI, that's coming up. The reason is interesting. That's where some of the original thought process emerged from, which I think is interesting because that's not a very obvious link, but that's kind of the point, as you'll hear him describe.
What we found in the ACE study involving 17,500 middle-class adults was that life experiences in childhood that are lost in time and then further protected by shame and by secrecy and by social taboos against inquiry into certain realms of human experience, that those life experiences play out powerfully and proportionately a half-century later in terms of emotional state, in terms of biomedical disease, in terms of life expectancy. In 1985, I first became interested in developmental life experiences in early childhood, really by accident. In the major obesity program we were running, a young woman came into the program. She was 28 years old and weighed 408 pounds, asked us if we could help her with her problem, and in 51 weeks took her from 408 to 132. And thought, well, my God, we've got this problem licked. This is going to be a world-famous department here. She maintained her weight at 132 for several weeks, and then in one 3-week period regained 37 pounds in 3 weeks, which I had not previously conceived as being physiologically possible. That was triggered by being sexually propositioned at work by a much older man, as she described him. And in short order, she was back over 400 pounds faster than she had lost the weight. I remember asking her why the extreme response, after initially claiming not to have any understanding of why the extreme response. Ultimately, she told me of a lengthy incest history with her grandfather from age 10 to age 21. Ultimately, it turned out that 55% of the people in our obesity program acknowledged a history of childhood sexual abuse. I mean, that obviously is not the only issue going on, but it was where we began. And as we went down that trail, then we discovered other forms of abuse, also growing up in massively dysfunctional households, etc. And the ACE study was really designed to see whether these things existed at all in a general population, and if so, how did they play out over time. We studied 10
So what I think's interesting there is he's talking about a I mean, he didn't use the word relapse, but he could have, I think. And like in a behavioral health context, clinicians will see that all the time. You know, basically, a person comes in to a treatment in a clinical setting, gets some sort of intervention, some sort of clinical intervention, and and to some extent it starts to work. But then something gets in the way and there's a quote unquote relapse, and everyone's very confused about what happened. Now, what happens here that's related to trauma-informed care is that the old way of looking at that would have been, well, obviously, you know, the client person wasn't motivated, or they didn't have enough willpower, or they're not really, you know, they kind of don't have this like proper sense of like fortitude to like get better. And that's very old. That's a kind of out of date way of thinking now, because a better question is the one that he starts to ask in these studies, and what's become more best practice is to look at it and go, well, wow, you know, that's first of all, that's kind of an extreme response. And instead of like judging the individual, it's it's sort of more useful to say, well, why is it an extreme response? What happened there? And so that's where there's been there's a major turning point in thinking about, well, where do clinical disorders even come from? You know? So then the other point that I think is very useful to kind of grapple with is that, and he explained this in this particular example with this one person, said, well, what, you know, what do you think happened? And they often don't know. And they either don't know, or perhaps it's just too painful to even talk about. And that's a hallmark right there of trauma. So, you know, I'd work with a young kid, and you'll ask them, well, why are you doing these behaviors? And they don't know. So that's what they say. I don't know. And it looks like a kind of like disengagement, or lack of engagement, or lack of motivation. But it's not really. And this is a key moment as we start to understand trauma better. Is like, no, that, well, I don't know. That's actually true. And so for them to say, well, I don't know, I don't even know what you're asking about, I have no idea. That's a sign that we're into actually the right area. But if we don't move in that area very skillfully, it's so easy to just disregard and say, well, they don't care, they don't know, they're not talking, they're not engaged, that kind of thing. So I really wanted to highlight that, because he implies strongly there that for this particular individual he's talking to, the idea of digging in and revealing the real reason why this response happened and this quote unquote relapse happened was unbelievably painful. And so that can only be done in the context of a really high trusting therapeutic relationship. And that just takes a long time to build up. It just can't be done with a few, clever phrases and just a short period of time, because there's so much distrust built up. And like we said, maybe back even through generations. So the fixes aren't quick. Let's keep going. He's going to talk about the 10 categories now and where they came from.
Categories of adverse life experience that were chosen because of their prevalence in the WAIT program: childhood sexual abuse, heavy-duty childhood physical abuse, I'm not talking spanking, major emotional abuse, recurrent humiliation, 2 categories of neglect, growing up in a home where one of the members of the household was chronically depressed, suicidal, mentally ill, or in the state hospital, growing up in a home without both biological parents, growing up in a home where one of the members of your household was alcoholic or a drug user, growing up in a home where mother was beaten, growing up in a home where one of the members of your household was imprisoned during your childhood or adolescence. Those were the 10 categories. In a middle-class population, 1 in 11 people has experienced 6 or more of those adverse life experiences in childhood. So this is very common, totally unrecognized. It was difficult for us to accept their commonness, but on the other hand, these are issues that most people never touch. And so who would know without routinely asking? But at a so-called ACE score 6, experiencing any 6 of the 10 categories that we studied, that person was 4,600% more likely to become an IV drug user than a person who had experienced none of those 10 categories. Okay? Now, you think, you read in the newspaper the latest cancer scare of the week, prostate cancer or breast cancer increases 30% and everyone goes nuts. I'm talking 4,600% increase. The same ACE score of 6 produces a likelihood of attempting suicide that is between 3,100 and 5,000% greater than the likelihood of suicide attempts in someone with none of those life experiences. So the power of this relationship is enormous. So ultimately the question arises, how do life experiences in childhood end up with disease states a half century later? There are at least 2 big categories to account for that. One is through the use of various coping devices. One smokes to feel better, one overeats to feel better, one drinks to relax, etc. And those things carried out in heavy amounts have major destructive patterns, even though they may be immediately beneficial. The other broad category has to do with the effect of chronic major unrelieved stress on the workings of one's brain and central nervous system. In recent years, and this is relatively new, it's become clear that chronic major unrelieved stress can produce the release of pro-inflammatory chemicals in a person's body. and also can suppress immune system function. Of the 10 categories that we studied, any 6 of them produces a shortening in life expectancy of almost 20 years. The magnitude of this problem is so huge, and the complexity of dealing with it after the fact is so huge, that realistically the only serious approach is going to have to involve primary prevention. No one knows how to do that, but it's the right question to focus on.
So this kind of information, when people hear it for the first time, is really rather kind of mind-blowing, really. But it's the its explanatory power of the correlation between adversity in childhood and, as he said, disease states 20, 30, 40 years later is really illuminating. Okay, so you heard him describe a couple of the kinds of data that get pulled from these studies. By the way, he's talking about the original study in the 90s. It's been replicated thousands of times now across the globe with more or less the same results. And the results tend to look like this, what you're looking at, this type of graph, the ACE score at the bottom. So 0 means, none of the 10 categories that he described have ever happened to you. Or if it's just 1 or 2 and you get your ACE score. And then, they superimpose that on, well, does the individual in this particular example use antidepressant medications as a middle-aged adult? And you can see the correlation as the ACE score goes up, the usage and prescription in this case goes up. Even and in many of these data sets and these graphs, you only really need to go up to 4 or 5 on the ACE scale to get the pattern. In this case, people with 5 experiences of adversity in their childhood are at 100%, 100 for depression. Depressant medication, antidepressant medication. That's remarkable. But it's the upward trajectory of the graphs that I want you to notice, creating a correlation that's just very clear. Here's depression, just goes up. This one only goes to 4. Alcoholism. COPD. I mean, I just took some random ones to show you the pattern. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. It's not immediately obvious why that would go up with trauma, but of course it does because of the 2 explanations, which I'll quickly review in a sec. The point here is that, and I'm speaking to a hospital audience, people are not only suffering with psychiatric conditions, it's medical too. In fact, the whole body system is affected. So even something like liver disease will go up with trauma. In fact, there's almost nothing that won't go up. Look at the kind of the tough end of the extreme end of mental health. We're talking about suicide behaviors, attempts, and deaths, and those go up. Actually, these go up pretty dramatically. You can see the curve, the upward trajectory of the curve is a little steeper there. So that's the correlation. And couple of things. The experiences of the adversity are more common than society has wanted to talk about traditionally. Generally unrecognized, although that's getting better. And it affects basically everything. It affects a person's psychological well-being, their psychiatric state, their medical health, their reliance on various forms of drugs, uh, whether they be prescription or not, and alcohol, and then their behaviors, of which suicide attempts is a strong example. Now, back at the sort of beginning of the decade, actually the century, the graphic that the CDC used to summarize the data stopped at this green level here, adverse childhood experiences, right? So they'd say, well, so you start here, you have adverse childhood experiences, neurodevelopment gets disrupted. And so, now we're into that world of complex trauma. The kid suffers with various impairments, and so they become, labeled, judged. They start to do poorly in places like schools, and so they adopt risky behaviors, like smoking would be a good example. And so they're now on a trajectory towards disability, social problems, disease, and even early death. And so it's a rather depressing scenario, but it's well illustrated. Now, in recent years, people have said, yeah, that's good, but to complete the picture, you should think about what came before the person was even born, in terms of things like as we discussed, intergenerational, cultural, racial trauma, and so now to build it better, it's usually presented like I'm showing you now, that takes into account the social context and the history. So now we've got if we start with like, oh, person has trauma. Now we're starting to build a much deeper understanding of what this is really about, so that when we see the behaviors, we can build a portfolio of responses that are better tuned in to a person that has all this. That's the direction of travel here. Now, I do want to quickly review those two explanations, because he did them kind of quick, because people might say, well, why? And he said, well, there's two things to understand. It's like, one is the strategies, and this is how we think of people's behaviors in mental health. It's like people are doing the best they can. They're trying to survive. They're trying to navigate the world, and they use coping strategies. They suffer extreme psychological and psychiatric torment, essentially, and they use strategies to help them. So this type of list is pretty common, and in recent years, we've got to add this: excessive exposure to social media, screens, texting, YouTube, etc. But it's all, in a way, it's all the same thing. It's like, I need to distract myself. I need to find a way to cope with what's happened, right? So these activities, behaviors or strategies, however you want to say it, over time lead to poor health. If you smoke if a person starts smoking when they're 14, by the time they're 40, that connection is pretty straightforward. So there's that. Now, the one that is even more insidious is this one. And he talked about how when a person is feeling fear and a threat to their existence, so now we're talking about trauma, then the stress response is produced. And it's chemical, and it's very, very quick, and it affects what type of hormones and neurotransmitters are circulating in a person's bloodstream. And there's over 130 of these. The big two that you've heard of and that people talk about is cortisol and adrenaline. And in a crisis, you want that because it pumps you up, enables a response that's quicker, stronger, more directed. But you only want that if the threat is, basically in front of you. You don't want that if what you have to do all day is try and parent, try and study, go shopping, do your thing, because now you've got this pro-inflammatory biology, essentially. People with, let me give you a good example of this. People who have a lot of trauma often show up in the doctor's office with an elevated heart rate. Because, when you're frightened, your heart beats faster, right? So, but then when the danger goes away, your heart rate goes down. Well, essentially, if the danger never really goes away, heart rate stays high. So people with a lot of trauma have elevated heart rates. And that's pretty measurable, right? I mean, it's like the body's kind of on a high alert the whole time. So just a good thing to note there. And then this response happens just so quickly and automatically. It's about half a second for it to like switch on. You can't turn it off. You wouldn't want to turn it off even if you could, but you can't. It's automatic. So, this has become popularized as fight or flight, and that's not bad. It isn't often thought of, though, as a chronic long-term condition, but it can be if the trauma isn't taken care of. It's like the body's just thinking, when's it going to happen again? When's it going to happen again? Is this the time? Is this it? The contamination affects every interaction almost, and the body becomes kind of worn out. Immune system is compromised. And the short-term like fix of something like drinking alcohol to calm you down becomes a long-term problem on a person's health and affects all different parts of their body systems. So it's a whole body problem, not just a psychological. The best way that I've ever had this explained to me is in terms of like a kind of bank of resources. So your body has this a sort of like a body budget almost. It says, well, I've got these resources. Where am I going to put them? And in a crisis, your body very quickly says, we'll put all our resources into, heart and lungs and muscles, and we'll get moving quick. And hopefully we can survive the situation that's, right up and dangerous, like in front of us. But so we don't really need to nourish the immune system right now because we just don't need it in the next 10 minutes. We can kind of get to that later. But of course, what if it's always switched on like this? Then the immune system becomes compromised. That's a really nice way of understanding what's going on. The body is sort of in kind of in panic mode the whole time. So that's where it puts its resources. So people have problems potentially reproductively, immune system, all these different skin, different body systems. So we wind up with the idea that the things that you see, these behaviors, in a way, are like a tip of the iceberg, to use a common metaphor in the literature. So you see physical violence, truancy, cutting, anger, things like sadness, depression, physical complaints, isolation, avoidance, a whole portfolio of different types of strategies, different types of behaviors. And that's what people see, that's what they focus on, that's what they judge, that's what they criminalize, that's what they try and treat. But underneath, the causes are deeper. And this is a huge long list. I want to make a special mention here for the idea of weathering. There's a term, actually it was originally used in the 70s, but it was become reused quite rightly. And it's a term that's applied to people who have to suffer racial discrimination and violence each and every day, on top of everything else. Like, so the stress response is just turned on the whole time. So that physiological problem that I just described is made even worse by this constant wearing down. Like if in nature, if something's weathered, it's just been sort of beaten down by the weather, the wind, the rain, over time, right? So that concept applies, unfortunately and tragically, to people too, especially black and brown people. So that's why that's in there. So this goes very, very deep indeed. But you'll see the iceberg metaphor used quite a lot in the trauma literature, and it's a pretty good one because it demonstrates something important, that you're just seeing a little bit of the top of what's really going on. So we're really in some very deep territory here as we become more informed about trauma and how to work with people with trauma. One practice is to be able to stay grounded, like ourselves. And then what happens is we teach this to our clients, to our kids too, so that they can do the same thing. Part of the solution is to come into the present moment. So if you've wondered why mindfulness meditation, and mindfulness-based stress reduction best practices have become important, this is the reason. It's because trauma brain, to use a term that's just easy to grab, trauma brain is always like looking back, remembering what happened and projecting forward and saying it's probably going to happen again. And then it produces the stress response. So one antidote to that is to say, well, try and stop looking back and looking forward for a minute and just come into the present moment. And one way to do that is breathing. But therapists will teach their clients all different types of grounding techniques, and they all try and do the same thing. It's like come back into the present moment where things are okay. So I listed a couple there, but the best one to start is learning how to breathe mindfully, because that connects you with your body and the present moment at the same time. Plus, you have to breathe anyway. So being mindful about how you breathe, being intentional, you kind of get a You get a nice sort of double effect there. All right. So let's think now a little bit about re-traumatization. So now now we're starting to understand how deep and difficult and neurobiological this problem is for people who, by the way, are just kids and don't really understand what's happened. Then they find themselves in a situation that they didn't ask for, they didn't choose, they don't like, and then on top of everything, has a possibility to like add even more trauma. I mean, let's think about this together. Why, why is a hospital environment so difficult for some people? Um, a place of like great comfort for others and perhaps sort of neutral for many. I mean, it must, I mean, because the environment's the same, but people's response and reaction to it is quite different. It must be on some level because of what's happened to them before. So as we head into trauma-informed territory, that's the kind of thinking. It's like this waiting room is just kind of neutral. Well, is it? It might be for me, I don't know, perhaps, but for someone else, it's almost intolerable. Why? And currently, some of the very best explanations for that difference is what we've been going through. I don't know what you think about that. Um, what do you, what have you, any thoughts? You could share thoughts here or just ponder it quietly. It's essentially, it's the right question, right? Because if you don't ask that kind of question and you just sort of say, well, you know, the waiting room is just what it is. People should sort of deal with it. Just picking on a waiting room. And by the way, you can use this analysis for all sorts of other places, like schools would be what I could do the same question. Why is a school so kind of great for some kids and terrible for others and neutral for many? It's just the same place. So could it be something in the system that's re-traumatizing? This is the right question. So re-traumatization means that you're like kind of reliving a past experience that you don't really want to. And remember Van der Kolk's uh, great quote. Oh, I think it's a great quote. He says, being traumatized means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma was still going on, with every encounter and event potentially contaminated from the past. So it's a kind of psychological phenomenon. It's very complex. Individuals' reaction to the current situation is significantly amplified because of unresolved trauma from a past experience. And I think thinking of it as a kind of trauma memory is very useful. You know, the brain encodes and stores traumatic experiences in a very fragmented manner. So they're not really well organized memories. You know, like if you if I if you remember something and you think, oh yeah, I remember being in the park and like playing on the swings, and my brother was there, and I can remember it. And you think, oh, okay, that's a memory, and hopefully I picked a good memory, sort of, or neutral. Well, that's not a fragmented memory. I can remember that. That's sort of organized or kind of filed away maybe in my brain. Trauma memories aren't like that. They're not integrated and they're not organized. They're just sort of, they like pop up in little fragments. That makes sense. So they're very difficult to deal with. Um, and now then you get little flashbacks, that kind of thing. Sometimes can just produce a cascade of anxiety or anger or some sort of behavior. So it makes us wonder what re-traumatization might happen that's systemic, that's from the medical system. So people are in the hospital, right? They don't want to be there. They didn't ask to be there. And now they've got to like go through things that just sort of like bring it all back, re-traumatize. So this was some that I was thinking about. Anything that requires disrobing could be horrendously traumatic for a person that's been raped, for example. You can feel that now. One that comes up a lot is repeatedly retelling their story. So when we think about care planning a little later into the curriculum, we want to try and reduce that as much as possible. If it's one thing for me to have to tell my story one time, but then I have to tell it again and again and again and again. If nothing else, I just feel like no one's really listening or cares. We can reduce that. It won't make a huge difference in that moment, but if we make little adjustments like that times 20, it could be 20, 25, 30% better. Bringing behaviors down, making the stay a little better. And that's the goal. Does anyone have any that they could add here? This is by no means meant to be a complete list. It's really we're just really entering the territory of like, okay, how do we start to think about what the implications of that research really are in the day-to-day? Because that's the bit that matters. Like the research, interesting and thorough and repeated that it is, doesn't do anything till we start analyzing its implications. So if you have other things that you could add to that list, that'd be useful. But this is a pretty good start. And all of these things, I think you could consider potentially dehumanizing. So that might be another framing that could be very important. No choice. I just want to quick mention that if you think about the experience of, let's say physical abuse as one of the list from the trauma, like the 10, I'll pick that. That kind of experience is like the embodiment of no choice, isn't it? When you're in a traumatic situation, as described by our definitions at the beginning, that's one of the hallmarks is you don't have any choice. It's being done to you, right? So coming out the other end and thinking about, okay, well, we've got to design services and interactions and produce care plans and de-escalate when necessary. Anything that produces some sort of feeling of control or choice is on the right track. It's not going to solve everything overnight, but it's a little break in this kind of unrelenting trajectory towards being controlled by everybody and all the systems. So keep that in mind as we progress through our curriculum. That's going to be a theme. Why? Because it's trauma informed. As much as it's possible to do, you want to give people little bits of choice, little decision points that they can engage in. Unfortunately, sometimes the re-traumatization comes directly from the staff. Now, there might be a lot of reasons for that are related to that concept of vicarious trauma. That now we have traumatized staff looking after traumatized children. This is a bad combination, obviously. So we have to think about how we're setting up our workplace with regard to things like emotional and psychological safety, and what kind of language we're using. We'll get into that. But the basic rule is you use language that's sort of person-centered. Why? Because it's a person. And if you start with that sort of precondition to everything, then you're on the right track. You're on the right trajectory. It's a person first, not a number, not a diagnosis. It's a person, right? So in the short term that I have here, just to get this all set up, I want to give you a sense for what trauma-informed practices are, like what kinds of things. I'm starting to try and infuse that in now, because you can describe the problem over and over and over. At some point, the question becomes, well, what kind of daily practices could be looked at that might go better long term? I think the very first one actually isn't a practice at all. It's a mindset. It's a way of approaching the idea of what's going on, which is try to get rid of this question in your mind. It's tough sometimes, but this happens a lot. You see a person, see a kid, acting out essentially, and you've heard it. You've heard it in the culture, in society. What is wrong with them? What's wrong with them? And we want to try and get to what happened to them. And that shift, that's deep in the literature around trauma-informed practices and care. And it's the key starting point, because now you're starting to ask a different question. So say, oh, I need to try and help the individual, try and help the kid, let's say, calm down. And if I'm going into it with, well, what is wrong with them anyway? That's not the right mindset to become effective in that moment, given what we've described. So a better question is, gosh, I wonder what happened. I wonder what's happened to them. And I wonder what's happened in the last hour. And it automatically sort of tracks you in the direction of, gosh, I need to work in a way that recognize the impact of past and current traumas, current as well, like now, today. So we had the past, and now we have the re-traumatizing, and we want to try and take those current ones right down and get them pretty much eliminated. So we want to reframe behaviors as kind of coping. Like in mental health, you won't spend too long around therapists before they start talking about coping skills, right? And that's really good. That's because that's what we do every day. We're trying to cope. We're all doing it. Right? We're trying to cope with our day, our situation, the nonsense that's going on in our lives. And we're trying to get through our day. And as we described at the beginning, is people's coping becomes dysfunctional over time if it's not adapted, there needs to be intervention and help and therapy. So, basically the reframe goes from words like oppositional and defiant to a more of a description of what's most likely actually happening. And so, well, the child is highly anxious and highly aroused right now. And then it makes you think, okay, why? What's happening? You got your trauma memories that are very fragmented and difficult to make sense of. And then you've got like, well, the child isn't in a sort of brain space, if I could use that phrase, to think or learn. And when you're stressed, it's hard to think because your brain goes back into its limbic and it's sort of hind brain, kind of automatic. That's where that fight or flight response is. And thinking's back up here, so you can't think and learn. So as you approach someone, you want to try and do things that actually help them think, like giving them a little question to answer or a little decision to make, something like that, rather than just telling them what to do. Child is attempting to reduce fear. Now, they might not be doing that very effectively, but nevertheless, that's what they're doing. And they might not even know that that's what they're trying to do. That makes me think of like, a kid who, well, I'll use a school environment. Spent a lot of time in my life in schools. My father was a teacher, so what about that's just a system though, isn't it? Where certain behaviors are expected. What about a kid who can't sit up at the desk, instead, gets under the table? Well, okay, trauma uninformed would be like, that's bad behavior, that needs punishing, you need to get out from under the table, etc. Trauma informed thinking is, that's kind of interesting behavior. The child is doing the best they can. They're probably highly aroused and anxious. They don't know what else to do, so they're protecting themselves. And probably they're try to reduce fear by getting under there. So now we're thinking in a better way. It was like, well, what are they afraid of? Rather than they're just being bad. So that's the big reframe. And honestly, everything really flows from that as you get deep into thinking about different types of trauma-informed practices. Everything comes from these last couple of slides. So I'm going to give you a couple tips. Like I said, the curriculum, we build it over the next, 45 hours. So it's 10 times 90 minutes. I think that's right. Yeah. So this will be the theme, is how to connect in these difficult moments, how to build build plans that help with this. But here's a couple of phrases that you might want to learn. We don't love the word hysterical, but nevertheless, as a learning tool, this is pretty good. When you see hysterical behavior, it's probably historical, right? And immediately you're like, oh, okay, what happened? So you're back into the same thought process, away from what's wrong and oh, what happened? Behaviors are protective, not defective. Both these top two, by the way, are from Resmaa Makkonen, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands, highly recommended book on uh, essentially racial trauma. Connection before correction. That's good, isn't that's nice because the old school is like, well, just correct what's going on, make it stop. But before that, we have to connect. So when we do de-escalation, you'll see that there's little moments of connection first, and then you use rapport to make the situation better. We didn't have time today to get into attachment, but it's a pretty short journey from adverse childhood experiences into a lack of secure attachment biology when the kid is growing up. So we think attention seeking is probably attachment seeking. Our person-centered approach focuses on what's strong, not what's wrong. So that's nice. What's not repaired is repeated. So those are the strategies just coming over and over and over. And people start to heal when they start to feel heard. So listening and making a person feel heard, these are the starting points. So let me just wrap up with the idea of protective factors, and you'll see these again, but I want to quickly do them now. As you look at different ACE studies, here's one from Minnesota, about 12 years ago, something like that. They did an ACE study in Minnesota. Look what they also find, despite the things we've discussed here, they also find that kids can thrive despite adversity, and they wrap it into the data as resilience. And so they study that group and say, well, what's interesting about that group is that they have high ACE scores, but as adults, they're doing actually quite well, and they find these protective factors. So there are things that happen that seem to protect a child from all the toxicity that we talked about. So this is what we build on as we develop our approaches, you know, and basically they're like grounded in trusting relationships. So that's the other side. That's the hopeful side of the ACE work, to build new neural pathways, just like a path through the snow. You're going to follow that path rather than go off on your own. As you have good experiences and good connections, you build new neural pathways as you grow up. And then you end up with 5 basic principles of trauma-informed. Just to I'll wrap it here. But we build it around safety, choice, building trust, collaboration, and empowerment. So those are the themes that we're going to build through the curriculum now. And they come from our understanding of trauma. We're right at 10:30, so I'll stop there. And I'll let you know that this is how to get in touch with us. So we are People Incorporated, the Training Institute at People Incorporated, and this is our email, and you'll get your completion certificate and a course eval within a few days. One or two is the goal. So with that, I'm gonna close the class there. If you and we'll stop the recording.